Hi guys, we're going to get going here on Chapter 10. Chapter 10 I'm going to segment up into probably 3 videos here. Chapter 10 deals with photosynthesis, and like cell respiration, photosynthesis is a relatively difficult process. I think if you create your own stories regarding the process that we're going to cover here, or try to mimic the story that I tell you, it becomes quite a bit easier as a result. So do pay attention, do jot down notes when I get to the process, but before we get to the processes of photosynthesis and the details that lie within, I'd like to talk about some introductory material, some stuff leading up to the actual process of photosynthesis and how it actually occurs. We need to talk about some kind of base material, some base knowledge, and that's what we're going to start with, okay? So the College Board would really like you to know about the evolution of photosynthesis as we kind of see it in modern day plants. Photosynthesis was not always around, and more likely than not it originated in prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are types of bacteria. Specifically, they think the culprit for the evolution of photosynthesis would be a little prokaryote named cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria is one of the only living prokaryotes that we know of that actually undergoes photosynthesis. And so the scientists think that it was some ancestor of modern-day cyanobacteria that is responsible for oxygenic photosynthesis, and they think that this actual process may have evolved around 3.5 billion years ago, so very close to the birth of the Earth, as it were. Okay, and so these little guys did contribute to the formation of our oxidizing atmosphere, and their presence and the fact that they actually undergo photosynthesis led to a stark rise in atmospheric oxygen around 2.5 billion years ago, somewhere in that neighborhood. Now, they do have evidence of this seen in rock formations, which I found actually quite interesting and kind of, one of those kind of, whoa, crazy moments that you just don't put 2 and 2 together unless you've kind of studied this stuff or have kind of a different perspective on things. But one of the things that scientists look for when they try to suss out these early processes that are so important to life today are they look at rock formations, they look at fossils and things of that nature. And what you see in front of you in the picture in front of you is a rock formation that has bands of iron oxide. Okay, these bright reddish orange bands that you see where the highlighter is or the pointer's at, those are little bands of iron oxide mineral. And if we know anything about iron oxide is rust, right? And we get rust because iron is exposed to oxygen and obviously oftentimes water, and it turns iron into this bright red material we know to be called rust or iron oxide. Now, obviously, rusting is not possible without oxygen, and so they can date these rocks very, very far back. In the neighborhood of 3 billion years ago, they can see rust in these rock formations, and things before that they don't see rust. So they can assume that the formation of oxygen, as atmospheric oxygen or oxygen that would have been able to interact with the iron, formed somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 billion years ago, because they can date the rocks that they find these rust bands in that you see in front of you. And so one of the things that they think is that these cyanobacteria were producing this oxygen in kind of watery environments, the primordial soup. They were producing this oxygen, which was then combining with the iron to make the rust, and eventually these cyanobacteria produced enough oxygen where the water that they lived in was saturated with it, and it eventually started to leave the solution of the water and enter the atmosphere. So very early on, some of the evidence that we see is this iron oxide, which tells us that the date in which oxygen was formed, which also kind of tells us the date that the process of photosynthesis was seen in organisms or things that produced oxygen, like photosynthesis. So there's different forms of photosynthesis, and the cyanobacteria did this. And one of the byproducts that we know to be of photosynthesis is oxygen, and it's one of the earliest ways that we can see the formation of this oxygenic atmosphere. Okay. Now, it begs the question, okay, so we just talked about prokaryotes, right? Prokaryotes being some of the first organisms to have this process known as photosynthesis, which takes the sunlight and turns it into food and energy and kind of harnesses the energy of the sun and then makes oxygen. So what about eukaryotes, right? Eukaryotes are us. And so we would like to know, okay, well, what is the formation of eukaryotic photosynthesis? Because that's what we see in modern day plants. And so that's the task or the goal of a lot of these evolutionary scientists, is that they want to figure out where this stuff started and now link it to where it is now today. And so to do that, we have to understand the evolution of eukaryotic photosynthesis. And scientists believe that it was eukaryotic photosynthesis arose because of the prokaryotic pathway, okay, the one that we saw in cyanobacteria, but that it is seen in eukaryotes because of something called endosymbiosis, okay? Endosymbiosis, or the endosymbiotic theory, explains the origins of things like mitochondria and chloroplasts, some of these organelles that we would see in our eukaryotic cells, because what scientists initially thought was that these little plastids, or the chloroplasts as we call them, or the mitochondria, if you look at them really closely, they almost look like bacteria themselves. They're smaller than eukaryotic cells. They have their own DNA. If you look at mitochondria and chloroplasts, they actually have their own DNA like a prokaryote would. They carry out their own functions like a independent living organism would. But we find them in our cells. And so at some point, scientists believe that early protobionts is what they would call these, very early cells, ancestral prokaryotes, if you will, would have actually tried to eat some of their little relatives, the mitochondria-like relatives. And so we see here that this cell right here that now has kind of an early formed nucleus is engulfing aerobic prokaryotes, ones that make ATP from oxygen. And so you can kind of see it's engulfing, it's trying to eat it. Okay, and so that's what we know as phagocytosis, and we've talked about that before, I think in chapter 7. So this cell is trying to eat the smaller prokaryote that looks like a mitochondria. And so this would have happened also with chloroplasts right here. And so this is not only describes why we see some organelles like mitochondria and chloroplasts in eukaryotic cells, but it also helps explain why eukaryotes now can undergo photosynthesis. So the way that that eukaryotic cells undergo photosynthesis is a product of the prokaryotic pathway, but it has now been repurposed. It has been engulfed by this other cell, so that we now have this, what we call this organelle, that can perform a very specialized function in the greater, larger cell. Kind of an interesting look into how that stuff actually evolved in much more advanced creatures than prokaryotes, okay, or bacteria. Okay, so let's continue on with our introductory material here. We've talked about different organisms. In Chapter 9, we've talked about organisms that obtain food, break it down, and get energy from it. In this chapter here, we're going to talk about organisms that produce their own food through the use of light energy. And so one of the things I wanted to get out of the way is just a little bit of vocabulary here for you guys, because these words I've noticed pop up, or derivatives of these words pop up, not only in this text and this chapter, but in coming chapters as well, or chapters that we might have seen already. So I want to use this opportunity to compare and contrast Chapter 9 with Chapter 10. In Chapter 9, we talked about organisms known as heterotrophs. Okay, heterotrophs obtain their own organic material, also known as food, by ingesting other organisms. And so we are heterotrophs. We are organisms that basically eat other things, and we break it down. We get energy from the fact that we break that food down. Photoautotrophs produce their own food through the use of light energy. And if you kind of break this word down into its roots, which is one of the reasons we continue to do those word roots, I'm hoping you are anyway. The term photo means light, the term auto means self, and troph means food, more or less. So this word means organisms that produce their own food through light. Okay, it makes sense when you break it down into those roots. So when you hear the term heterotrophs, make sure you understand you're talking about things like us that take in food and break it down and make ATP from it. And you talk about photoautotrophs, you're talking about things like plants that make their own food. Okay? So let's compare and contrast photosynthesis and respiration as processes as well, since they are kind of linked, they are kind of related. The equation for one is actually just the reverse of the other. We want to kind of compare what we've already learned in Chapter 9 and just use it like a little review, okay, because you guys could use that on Chapter 9, and then kind of expand on it for Chapter 10. Respiration, okay, cell respiration is an exergonic redox process, okay, meaning we get energy out. That ATP that we get out of the back end would be why we call it exergonic, because energy is being released, and we can basically package up that energy in ATP and use it for something else. So energy is released from the oxidation of sugar. Respiration is an oxidative process, whereas photosynthesis is going to be a reductive process. Okay, so again, we can follow the electrons in this process, and that helps us to gain a better understanding of what's actually occurring in the process of photosynthesis. Okay, so the electrons associated with sugar's hydrogens lose potential energy as the carriers, electron transport chains, carry them to the oxygen. So that is respiration, right? Whereas photosynthesis, as I just mentioned, is a reductive process, and it is an endothermic process. Okay, so it would behoove us to follow the electrons, very similar to what we did, although a little bit less intensive. Follow the electrons through the process of photosynthesis, and what we actually see here is the reduction of carbon dioxide happens in photosynthesis. So we think again, what is reduction? Reduction is gain. Oil rig. Reduction is gain. Oil rig. So CO2 is going to be gaining electrons. And think about, what do we mean by electrons, right? We mean hydrogens. Right? We talked about how we can correlate electrons and hydrogens when we look specifically at the equations for photosynthesis and cell respiration. Okay, so if we center our attention here on CO2, okay, and we compare it to the opposite side of the chemical equation, we know that, okay, here is C, and here would be the O, okay, correlates to CO2. So over here we have C and O, which correlates to CO2. What has CO2 gained if we compare it on this side to this side? It has gained hydrogens, okay? So CO2 has been reduced. And we can kind of, I threw this graphic in, although it's a little bit more confusing. We can look at CO2 as one of the reactants, and we can say, okay, where is CO2? The components of CO2 wind up in sugar as we follow these red arrows. And we notice that, oh, wow, if we look at the products, the CO2, or the carbon and the oxygen from CO2, has gained some hydrogens, which also means it has gained electrons, right? And if it gains electrons, it is reduction. Gain of electrons is reduction. Reduction is gain, okay? So that's how we can compare the movement the movement of electrons in cell respiration versus photosynthesis. Okay, so let's talk about the energy associated with it. Photosynthesis is an endergonic redox process. The molecule that is being reduced is carbon dioxide, and the source of energy, because we know that an endergonic process, and this was learned in Chapter 8, in an endergonic process, we have to add energy into the process for the reaction to actually occur. And so that's what actually happens in photosynthesis, and that light from the sun is the source of the energy that we add to the reaction. And so if we think about how this works, as long as there's sunlight, as long as the sun still keeps shining, and as far as I know, that's not going to end for another billion years or whatever it is, and that's a long, long time, photosynthesis should be possible. Okay, so the light is actually going to play into or work with the electrons that we just talked about in this reduction process. Between carbon dioxide not having these electrons and carbon dioxide gaining these electrons, those electrons are going to become energized. They are going to gain energy from the sun, and then the sugar molecule kind of captures those high energy electrons and harnesses that energy in this molecule we call sugar. And that's the process that we're going to talk about. So let's take it slow. Let's talk about where photosynthesis actually occurs. Now, some of this stuff I guess I'll want you to know in some respect. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and draw on this. So I got to pull up a picture for this, folks. Oh, that's the wrong one. I want this one. All right, perfect. So we know that photosynthesis happens in plants, right? And that's number one thing. We know that most of us probably know that photosynthesis occurs in the leaves. And more as an extension to that, you can think of photosynthesis actually occurring in any part of the plant that's green. And most of the time that is leaves, but in some instances it can be stems as well. But what we're going to talk about here is really the leaf as the site of photosynthesis. Okay, so this gives us a picture of a leaf, great, and then it shows us a little cross-section of a leaf. And so what it's zooming in on is a portion of the leaf called the mesophyll layer. Okay, you don't need to worry about the term mesophyll layer or anything like that. As far as I know, they've never tested you on your knowledge of that. But in the mesophyll layer, again, you don't have to know mesophyll cell either. There are cells, right? There are plant cells in the mesophyll layer, and that's what we can kind of see up here as well. So they zoom in on one of these mesophyll cells, and inside of these mesophyll cells in the plant, you notice that there are chloroplasts. Now that you're going to have to know, okay, because the chloroplast is the active site of photosynthesis in plant cells. And those plant cells that do photosynthesis oftentimes are in the mesophyll layer that you saw right there. Okay, so I do want you to know about the chloroplast. And down here they give you two different pictures showing what a chloroplast is. This is the idealized version right here. This is the electron. This one right here is the electron microscope view of what a chloroplast is. So I always like showing that one, or at least including it, because that's what it actually looks like. But this one that we see over on the right is much more adaptable for learning purposes, right? So what you need to know from this is basically everything that you see here. And I think at some point I've actually shown this and kind of circled some of this stuff. But I want you to understand that the actual active site for photosynthesis within the chloroplast is something called the thylakoid. Okay, the thylakoid are these little green discs that you see in here. Okay, and the chloroplast organizes a bunch of different thylakoids all together in something called granum. And granum or grana are basically just stacks of thylakoids. Okay, now, pardon me, the thylakoid, the active site of photosynthesis, can be broken, has other pieces of anatomy that we need to know, okay? It has the thylakoid membrane, and it has the thylakoid space, okay? And so now we are going to talk a little bit more in depth about that, and you'll see more zoomed in pictures of a thylakoid, so I'm not going to really draw a thylakoid for you, you know what? I could do that. I could draw you a thylakoid once we get done talking with this picture. But anyway, within the chloroplast, there is also something known as the stroma. Okay, and I want you to know what the stroma is because I'll refer to the stroma. Basically, what the stroma is the liquid or the space that fills in all of the kind of empty space of the chloroplast that is not occupied by the thylakoid. Okay, so the stroma is kind of like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. If you're thinking about the chloroplast maybe as its own cell. Okay, so let me go ahead and bring up another picture here, or another blank canvas, and I will draw you a very rudimentary thylakoid. Okay, because I think it's important enough that you see it, because the thylakoid is, let me get, come on, there we go, green. All right, the thylakoid basically looks like a flattened pancake. I think the book refers to it most like pita bread or something like that. And the thylakoid has an empty space in the middle called the thylakoid space. And it also has a membrane, and this is called the thylakoid membrane. Nothing revolutionary. My picture is about the simplest thing you could have, but this thylakoid membrane is very similar to a cell membrane, and this thylakoid space is very similar to like what the cytoplasm might be. Or if you want to compare it maybe to the mitochondria, it would be very similar to the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, that space inside the mitochondria. These thylakoids also have some kind of similar space, and this is the actual active site of photosynthesis. And so when we get deeper into the details, I will talk more about how this is the active site and what we need to understand from the active site. Okay. All right, so on we move. So I talked briefly here about the fact that the thylakoid, the chloroplast, and within the chloroplast, the thylakoid, are active sites for photosynthesis, right? But within the thylakoid and the chloroplast, photosynthesis does not happen. Photosynthesis does not happen without photosynthetic pigments. Photosynthetic pigments are responsible for capturing the light energy of the sun. And there are many different photosynthetic pigments that are associated with light reactions of photosynthesis. But there are two major ones that we are going to talk about. Okay? So let's just briefly review again here. What happens during photosynthesis? In photosynthesis, light energy is converted into chemical energy. And this is done when the energy of light, the sun's light, is passed to weak electrons. Okay, so these weak electrons basically don't have much energy associated with them. And so when we pass the energy of the sun's light to these weak electrons, it makes them mighty. It makes them energized. Okay, and we've talked about the importance of harnessing the energy that electrons have in cell respiration. And in this process, we're going to talk about how we energize those electrons, how we make those electrons mighty. And there's a bit of a disturbing picture here of Conan the Barbarian with an electron face, showing you that these things become mighty and they become energized when at one time they were weak. Now, the only molecule that we know, or one of the few molecules that we know of that is capable of passing this high energy of the sunlight onto the electrons, is a molecule known as chlorophyll A, and to some extent a molecule known as chlorophyll B. And up at the top of this picture, of this slide here, we see a picture of chlorophyll A, and I'm going to zoom in on that picture right here. You don't need to know anything about this, so to speak. I want you to know that it exists, and I want you to know where it's found, but chlorophyll A is this big chunky molecule right here, and that's responsible for harnessing the photons of light from the sun. Okay, and oftentimes in these pictures that you will see here, it is idealized by just breaking it down to this green dot. And so here in the thylakoid membrane is where we see chlorophyll A molecules, clusters of chlorophyll A molecules all kind of put together. It almost looks like if you guys have solar panels on your house, they look like little solar panels, and they work very similar to solar panels in that they capture these photons of light, and then they can transfer those photons of light to where they can be most utilized. Okay? Now, we have to kind of understand what wavelengths of light these molecules like to gather. Okay? Because the leaves don't actually like all of the light that the sun gives, and we understand that we can break down sunlight into these different wavelengths, right? If we know what electromagnetic radiation is, we can think of what the visible light spectrum is, and it turns out that plants, or specifically chlorophyll A, really love to harness photons of light with certain wavelengths. Okay? So if we look at this picture, this is called an absorption spectrum, okay? And this is nothing more than a graph that depicts what types of light certain types of molecules will absorb, okay? And so we look at the absorption spectrum for chlorophyll A. It shows us that there is a high absorbance or a high amount of absorption of these photons of light in the wavelengths of anywhere between 400 and 450 nanometers, okay? And so this tells us that the molecule called chlorophyll A, because it absorbs these photons of light, means that it likes them and it grabs them and holds on to them, right? And it also really likes photons of light that are in the neighborhood of about 650 to 680 nanometers, okay? So it likes to grab onto these as well. It absorbs these, meaning it likes to keep them, and it finds purpose with them, and it can use those photons of light. Now, we don't see absorbance in the wavelengths of around 500 to, 550 or 600, okay? And that means that plants, or chlorophyll A, doesn't really like those photons of light. So, in a manner of speaking, it would reflect those photons of light, which is why we see plants as green in color, okay? And you guys have probably learned this, maybe in physics, but the reason plants are green is because they actually spit out the photons of light that they don't like. And so it's just kind of this weird dichotomy where you have plants which we stereotype as green. Oh man, every time we see a plant, it's green. That must mean plants love green light. Actually, it's the complete opposite. Plants actually hate green light. They don't do anything. Those photons of light don't do anything for the plant. Plants really love photons of light that are somewhere in the blue to violet, and also in the orangish to red colors. And so they suck those in, which means we don't see them, and they spit out the green photons of light, which is why we see that stereotypical green color. Now, chlorophyll B is a second type of plant pigment that is also responsible for absorbing some types of light. And they absorb less light used for actual photosynthetic processes than chlorophyll A does, but they do help a little bit. And they will absorb some of the green, obviously not all of it, because we see a lot of green reflected, which it also indicates just how little chlorophyll B probably does for the photosynthetic process. And we also will see them kind of absorb some of the yellow color. So it's a way for the plant to harness as much light energy as possible, since chlorophyll A really likes the blue and the violet and the red and the orange. And this other pigment molecule is there to help out, grab a few extra photons of light. Okay. Now we also see that there is absorption in other wavelengths of light as well. Okay. And these absorption spectrums are shown here. So you see the typical chlorophyll A one that we see here, and we saw it in the previous one, and the chlorophyll B, which would line up to what we saw in this previous one. But we also see this yellow one, okay? And it's a yellow color because the carotenoids spit out. You see no spikes in this yellow region, right? So these carotenoids really like to absorb wavelengths of light in kind of this bluish, greenish area, okay? And so these carotenoids are something called accessory pigments, and I wanted to at least introduce these, not talk real heavily on them, but these accessory pigments are also light-absorbing compounds, similar to chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. In fact, they work in conjunction with chlorophyll A a little bit and chlorophyll B. They do help in the photosynthetic process. They help to gather light energy and create sugar at least a little bit. But their main purpose is not necessarily for collection of light for the photosynthetic process, but as that they have other primary functions. They have other duties. They primarily help with photoprotection, okay? And that is important because rogue, like high energy electrons and rogue photons of light that are seen in the plant can cause massive amounts of destruction in the plant cells. And so these accessory pigments, known as carotenoids, xanthophylls, anthocyanins, these are all examples of different types of accessory pigments. These type of accessory pigments function more in the protection of the plant from rogue photons of light. So they'll collect these little rogue photons of light that are around that could possibly cause physical damage to the plant. And so that's their main purpose. Their main purpose is this kind of accessory function, this other accessory function other than just photosynthetic light harvesting, okay? And as a result, these accessory pigments provide different colors to the plant. So carotenoids provide these, and I'll flip to, we don't need to necessarily know this, but carotenoids produce yellow-orange colorations and sometimes brown. Oftentimes you'll see a lot of carotenoids in, oddly enough, carrots. It's where carrots get their names, right? Things like anthocyanins and xanthophylls, those types of pigment colors, they are responsible for spitting back to our eyes these red and purple, bright red and purple photons of light. And so we see things like grapes or blueberries or cherries, cranberries, these bright red, deep blue colorations. Those are examples of parts of a plant that are heavy in the photosynthetic or the pigment called anthocyanins, okay? And so you have obviously noticed that different parts of the plant have different colorations, and even you've noticed in fall, the leaves, which at one point were green, all of a sudden turn these crazy different colors, right? And it's beautiful during that time. And the reason for that is because there's these accessory pigments. And so the fact that leaves turn color in the fall is due to the fact that the chlorophyll A and B, which spit out this green light during summertime and springtime, are no longer needed in the fall because there's such a small amount of light that's needed. What the cell does is it actually recycles those chlorophyll A's and chlorophyll B's and breaks them down, uses them for something else, which means that green coloration is all of a sudden gone. And when that green coloration is all of a sudden gone, we get this unmasking of these accessory pigments that were there all the time. But they just weren't there in enough numbers to overcome the massive amounts of green color that was there because of all of the chlorophyll that's needed to harvest the light during the summer and spring. Okay, so if you wanted a deeper understanding of that, feel free to read this slide. It discusses the in detail, a little bit more in detail, why colors of leaves change in the fall. Okay, but I included it in there because I thought it was interesting and kind of one of those high interest things that sometimes you don't get or see enough of, and you just learn all the super boring stuff, which we might be getting to. I think this is the fascinating stuff, but this is the stuff I'm going to stop this video here. I'm going to start a new video, but all of the stuff that we just previously talked about, these light harvesting pigments, the thylakoid and the chloroplasts, all that stuff we're going to get in deeper detail into, and how those structures and how those things actually help to harvest the energy of the sun's light, pass it to the electrons, and then get those high energy electrons incorporated into sugar molecules. Okay? So I will see you in that